Hello, everyone. No time, no see. Thank you very much for coming, for staying with us. As you know, the presidency of the Russian Federation continues in the Security Council, and today we are holding another press conference. I have these three American speakers, and I would call them public diplomats, who just came back from Donbass area. Certainly, they have a lot to tell you what they have seen, and even to show. So they will have short statements, and after that, they will be happy to answer your questions. And let me introduce the speakers. So the first one is Daniel Kovalik. He is lawyer, human rights scholar, peace activist. Christopher Hilali, a member of the Administrative Committee, United National Anti-War Coalition, International Secretary of the Communist Party. And Jackson Hinkle, political commentator, journalist. So, Dan, you have the floor. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to talk about my recent trip to Lugansk, which I just came back from. However, I want to note that in the last year and a half, I've been to Russia 5 times. On one trip, I went to Crimea. I've been to Donetsk twice and to Kherson. So I think I have a good handle on what's happening in some of those, I guess, for lack of a better word, contested areas. But as I said, we just got back from Lugansk, and I think it's important to note that we were hosted both inside Russia, mainland Russia, and Lugansk by the Union of Political Immigrants and Political Prisoners of Ukraine. That is to say, we were not hosted by the Russian government. We weren't even hosted by Russian citizens. We were hosted the entire time by people who were born in Ukraine, some who emigrated to Russia, some who have stayed within at least what was Ukraine before the SMO. Our main individual who showed us around in Lugansk is a guy named Alexei. He's from Odessa. And he was at the Odessa Trade Union building when, I'm sure all of you know, on May 2nd, 2014, rightists that were loyal to Kiev burned the building down with people inside it, murdering 48 individuals. If you don't know about that, then I don't know what to say. That event helped spur on the people of Lugansk and Donetsk to seek independence from Ukraine because it was targeted against Russian-speaking people. And they were worried that more violence was to come, and they declared independence after referenda. And this is important to note, by the way. You know, some experts have properly said that their right to independence is actually even greater than that of Kosovo's, which never did have a referendum. But of course, the West recognizes Kosovo as an independent republic, but does not recognize Donetsk and Lugansk for political reasons, not for any other reason. By the way, Alexei said, he quoted, and I'm forgetting the guy's name, I'm sorry, I believe he was a Protestant minister who said back during World War II in Germany, he said first they came for the communists, then they came for the trade unionists, then they came for the Christians. And Alexei said that's exactly what happened in Ukraine after 2014. They came for the communists, they came for the trade unionists, of course, again, burning down the trade union hall in Odessa, and then they came for the Christians, right? Destroying Orthodox churches, for example, that continue to be loyal to the patriarch in Russia. Again, something not covered very well in the press. None of this is, of course. The press has utterly become a mouthpiece for the State Department on this. In fact, I would say, and I would chastise the press, if I may, I think this is the worst covered conflict I've ever seen in my lifetime. It's frankly a joke, and it's just shame how this has been covered. We visited a mass grave in Lugansk known as the Open Wound. I say a mass grave. I mean, the people are properly buried, but they're buried en masse, in many with Many of the people buried are unidentified. These are people that have been exhumed, people killed by the Ukrainian government since 2014, now finally probably given a proper burial in this area, which is also a monument to the dead, to the victims of Ukraine. Sergei Belov accompanied us on this day to that monument. He himself was part of a group that helped exhume over 1,000 bodies of such victims over the years. Of course, it needs to be reiterated because, again, I think the press has forgotten this willfully, that 14,000 people died in the war between Kiev and the Donbass between 2014 and the start of Russia's military operations in February of 2022. That is, before Russia began those operations, 14,000 people were already dead in that conflict. And that's a 14,000 people, frankly, that have been largely forgotten because their existence and their deaths is inconvenient to the narrative of the West on this issue. I was happy to meet there. We met with Faina Safinkova. She's a young poet and journalist. She's age 15. She's from Lugansk. She still lives in Lugansk. She's interviewed me a couple times before we met her, so it was nice to meet her. She's been writing since the age of 11 and, of course, has been on the Ukrainian kill list since the age of 12, a great threat to the government in Kiev. She remembers as a young girl the siege of Donbass by Ukraine in 2014, in which water and electricity were cut off for 2 months. She remembers living in her cellar to hide from the shelling by Kiev in 2014 to 2015. You may remember that, in fact, President Poroshenko vowed that while his children in the West would go to schools, the children in the Donbass would spend the rest of their lives in cellars, as she did. Very nice. Her message, I asked her point blank, I said, if you could say anything to Americans, what would you say? She said that this conflict did not start in 2022. It started in 2014. And another inconvenient fact, and she speaks for many people, she welcomed the SMO. She welcomed Russia's intervention in 2022. Wish it had started sooner to protect the people, those 14,000 people who were killed up to that point. We met with Anna Rienel, chief of the organizational department of the 150,000-member Trade Union Federation of Lugansk, a union founded after Lugansk became independent in 2014 because it was not very safe to do so before independence. She also said she welcomed Russia's special military operations for the same reason, because she specifically said it was necessary to prevent an imminent invasion which Ukraine was preparing, in which at least some say was 2 or 3 days away by the time the SMO began. And I actually have a couple of nice props for you. I would refer you to this book by a guy named Jacques Baud. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. He's from Switzerland. He was a Swiss intelligence officer from the West. And he verifies that that is true, that Ukraine was mounting forces on the border of the Donbass before the special military operations began, preparing for an invasion. And by the way, this is also backed up by the Organization of European Security and Cooperation, which recorded over 2,000 ceasefire violations between Kiev and the Donbass in the weekend before Russia invaded in February of 2022. This was a massive increase in ceasefire violations. Of course, the OESC has, I believe, 57 members, many from the West. The U.S. is on it. And up till recently, at least, it was headed by a German. So it's hardly a pro-Russian organization who said that. What I will say, I want also just a couple brief observations, then I'll turn it over to my colleagues. I was impressed by a few things in Lugansk. First of all, we did not go to the front lines. We were in the cities, and the cities felt fairly calm and normal. A lot of construction is happening there that, frankly, Russia is doing. The main road into the city of Lugansk is built by Russia, brand new road. And every time a building gets shelled, and they continue to be shelled by Kiev, by the way, that's your tax dollars at work. Kiev is shelling civilian buildings, people in Lugansk to this day. We saw some of those buildings. But frankly, as soon as they're shelled, the Russians go in and help start rebuilding, right? And so we saw buildings that were recently shelled, but they had brand new windows that had been put up. So I'd like to compare that to how Israel's going to treat the people of Gaza after they've destroyed 75% of their infrastructure. I am certain, I will just say I'm morally certain after visiting Donetsk and Kherson and Crimea that the people of those regions will never want to be part of Ukraine again, and frankly should not be. That Ukraine, frankly, gave up its right to those areas when they started murdering their own people there. And in regards to Crimea in particular, which a Ukrainian official recently described the people who live there and have lived there for centuries as occupiers, by the way, in a very genocidal language, I refer you to a March 18th, 2020 Washington Post article entitled 6 Years and $20 Billion in Russian Investment Later, Crimeans Are Happy with Russian Annexation. And that is true. I can guarantee that people of Crimea want to be part of Russia. I know the West doesn't care what they want and is happy to supply arms that murder beachgoers, including children, as happened recently. Can you imagine if Cuba used Russian weapons to murder beachgoers in Miami? But the people there, the people of the Donbass, they'll never go back to Ukraine, not willingly. And that's Kiev's fault. And it's the U.S.'s fault for backing a right-wing regime in Kiev that has Nazi elements in it. Again, a very inconvenient fact. I'll just say, as we move closer and closer to a direct confrontation with Russia, towards nuclear annihilation, which so few seem to care about, this historical reality and the experiences and desires of the people in these regions must be taken into account and respected. And I'll say again, the failure of the U.S. press to properly acknowledge and report on these realities has been nothing less than shameful. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. And Chris, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, everyone, for this opportunity to speak to you all today. My colleague here, Dan Kovalik, and I recently returned from a fact-finding mission to the Lugansk People's Republic, hosted, as Dan rightfully pointed out, by the Union of Political Emigrants and Political Prisoners of Ukraine. After months of arduous planning and organizing, we felt this delegation was essential for us to see the situation on the ground for ourselves, including interviewing locals and officials who have been party to this conflict since it started in 2014. That is a critical point. This war did not begin in 2022 with Russia's special military operation. Rather, it began in 2014. And I want to emphasize this point. The people of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics in the Donbass have endured a decade of bombardment, terrorism, and brutality, all of which have been severely underreported or even misreported in the West. We visited mass graves containing hundreds of dead civilians, some of whom remain unidentified to this day. They are a small fraction of the tens of thousands of civilians killed or injured during this siege on the Donbass. We saw shelled civilian infrastructure and other physical instances of war crimes committed by the Ukrainian military. What we discovered provided a completely different understanding that went beyond the myopic narratives proffered by the mainstream media here in the United States and in the West. On our delegation, we were joined by two Georgians, a journalist and an activist. The similarity between Georgia and Ukraine vis-à-vis Western involvement in NATO expansion is striking. Georgians fear that the next front for the United States and NATO will be in the Caucasus, as it was in 2007-2008. First and foremost, the narrative that Russia, quote-unquote, invaded the Donbass in 2014 is completely false, and we saw that on the ground. It not only strips the local population of their agency, but it further promotes an understanding of a population which is occupied against their will. The reality is that the people of the Donbass were citizens of Ukraine in 2014. Many still are. Some served in the Ukrainian government, in its military, and its police forces. However, the Maidan uprising in 2014 and the removal of President Viktor Yanukovych sent shockwaves throughout the country. The rise of extremist groups, including prominent neo-Nazi militias and forces, as well as the rampant historical revisionism and denial of the Russian language and identity, were critical components of the eventual internal civil strife that quickly morphed into what can aptly be described as a civil war. As Human Rights Ombudsman and former Deputy Foreign Minister of the Lugansk People's Republic, Anna Soroka, put it to me, I was a Ukrainian officer. We were told to love our motherland and to be patriotic. I feel personally betrayed. It was Ukrainian police that provided security in the regions that voted in the referendums for independence. It was Ukrainian police and military personnel who felt that the new government in Kiev was not in the best interest of their people and decided to provide protection and support to their people in the Donbass. They simply changed their uniforms, but they remained Ukrainian. Thus, it was Ukrainians who were struggling with one another over their past, their present, and their future. We witnessed firsthand the crumbling infrastructure, closed factories, unpaved roads, and dilapidated tenements. Here it is critical to note that we heard from people throughout the Lugansk region that from 1991 to 2014, there was very little investment in eastern Ukraine. Eastern Ukraine was left destitute with no program of reconstruction, rehabilitation, investment, and development. On the contrary, the bulk of the money was concentrated in Kiev and western Ukraine. This led to eastern Ukraine being considered by many as a backwards, uneducated, and primitive territory, with homeless, drunk, dirty, and antisocial people, as it was put to me by locals. This division between western and eastern Ukraine has historical legacies that are important to analyze and to understand. The demographic crisis in post-Soviet Ukraine reveals a deeper terminal crisis, as millions left in search of better lives. However, since 2022 and the region's incorporation into the Russian Federation, there has been a tremendous amount of investment and improvements in infrastructure in the Donbass. We witnessed the paving of new roads throughout the region, as well as the construction of new apartment buildings, university housing, playgrounds, schools, as well as the rehabilitation of older facilities and factories. As one local resident put it, when Russia intervenes, it leaves roads, libraries, and schools. When NATO invades the country, all it leaves is rubble. We had the opportunity to visit the Alchevsk Iron and Steel Works plant, a metallurgical complex that dates back to the 19th century. During the Soviet Union, the factory employed upwards of 60,000 people, one of the largest plants of its kind in Europe. Under the Ukrainian government, the factory was privatized, outsourcing its management and operations. By 2010, the plant had only 7,000 workers. This economic upheaval, we were told by local residents, led to the murder of 2 directors of the plant as a result of the privatization efforts and the resistance to them by the local population. Since 2014, the plant has expanded its work and now employs around 14,000 workers. The siege on the region by Ukrainian forces led to the plant being shelled, as well as the neighboring technical university, which saw its dormitories attacked with precision munitions. We saw the scars on the buildings from missiles, mortars, artillery, and drone attacks, which were being rehabilitated and repaired by local authorities. The Donbass is a land of many wounds. Near historic landmarks from the Great Patriotic War, where thousands of Jews, communists, Soviet civilians of Russian ethnic origin, and other undesirables, quote-unquote, were massacred, locals recounted the brutal massacre of children during the Great Patriotic War. Plucked from the arms of their mothers, these children were executed by Nazis and their Ukrainian nationalist collaborators who put cyanide under the noses of children because bullets were too precious to be wasted on children. It was near this site where a nursing home for the elderly was commandeered in the early days of the war in 2014 by Ukrainian forces who used the elderly as human shields. In the coming days, an accident led to a catastrophic fire that killed many of the elderly nursing home residents, many of whom could not ambulate and thus were burned alive on the second floor. We were told of Ukrainian paramilitary forces, many of them ultranationalist and neo-Nazi, who in one instance beat an old man with the butts of their rifles and then shot him to death in front of his neighbors. In our discussions with locals and officials, we were made aware of the plethora of war crimes committed by Kiev-backed forces since 2014. In the summer of 2014, Lugansk was under a full military, social, economic, and humanitarian blockade. Ukraine used water as a weapon of war, cutting off water supplies to numerous villages in Lugansk. Children were forced to travel via foot or public transit through active fire zones up to 20 to 30 kilometers to attend school. We visited the site of a days-old attack on a residential building by a precision US-supplied HIMARS missile that killed 4 civilians in the city of Lugansk. The foul smell of the sulfur from the rocket's propellant was still prominent on the site. We visited other sites of destruction throughout the city and region. One apartment complex that had been targeted with U.S.-supplied munitions led to the shattering of over 1,600 windows. All around us, on every face of the buildings, we could see no windows, plastic sheets, or some new windows being installed. This is terrorism. Locals recounted the case of the Stanitska-Luhanska bridge, which was destroyed by Ukrainian forces in 2015. The bridge, a critical piece of infrastructure in the region and the sole crossing point, had collapsed down into the riverbank. A Ukrainian car, we were told, had also come onto the ruined bridge and exploded, leading to further destruction of the bridge. People were forced to navigate the extremely dangerous and treacherous rubble to cross back and forth to see family or for other needs. Pensioners were forced to go back and forth to the Ukrainian side to receive their state pensions. However, they could only do so with a bank card and needed to present themselves personally to the bank to collect their pensions. For elderly pensioners, this was a gross violation of their rights, especially for those who were not ambulatory. Thus, people were forced to climb this broken bridge for over 4 years. Traffic was usually around 12,000 people per day. The government in Kiev refused a temporary bridge proposed by the International Committee of the Red Cross, and later Germany sent millions of euros for the bridge's reconstruction, which was done in a poor and haphazard way. We had the opportunity for extensive talks with Vladislav Nikolaevich Denego, former foreign minister of the Lugansk People's Republic. Minister Denego provided us with extensive insider knowledge of the diplomatic and peace negotiations from 2014 through 2022. He even allowed us to look at original signed protocol agreements that were part of the Minsk Accords. In our discussions, it became abundantly clear that the chaotic situation within the Ukrainian government post-2014 led to the further erosion of trust and cooperation between the people of the Donbass and the Kiev regime. Many agreements that were reached were not enacted, enforced, or positions were changed overnight. We were told of the United Nations' involvement in the Lugansk People's Republic, which requested UN support by then Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, who dispatched Stephen O'Brien, the United Nations Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordination, to help with the situation in Lugansk. O'Brien came to Lugansk and helped with the repairs to civilian infrastructure and equipment. While a letter of thanks was received from Stephen O'Brien by the Lugansk authorities, there was no recognition of the referendum of independence overwhelmingly passed by the people in Lugansk. In fact, the United Nations itself continued to refer to the Lugansk People's Republic as terrorists until 2016, when the use of terrorists ceased. It is clear for everyone to see that the people of Lugansk are not terrorists. The people of the Donbass have been at war for 10 years. 10 years of trauma, an entire generation has lived through this war. Yet the resilience and tenacity of the people is remarkable. Under these dire conditions, life continues and people seek to enjoy their lives. Yet the danger of an all-out war between the United States and its NATO allies and Russia remains. Many locals we met were resentful of Russia for not recognizing the Lugansk and Donetsk People's Republics for 8 years, leaving them in a permanent state of limbo. The slogans of Russia, Russia, Russia in 2014 were chanted with the aim of being, not with the aim of being part of Russia at the time, but calling to be protected by Russia, to protect the civilians from a Western-backed regime that was outlawing their culture and traditions inherited from the USSR and trying to change them by imposing historical revisionism and foreign cultural values. This war is one of survival for the people of the Donbass, not of separatism, expansion, or Russian quote-unquote imperialism. Since early 2014, the people of the Donbass have called on the Ukrainian government to agree to protect, as one local put it, our rights, our language, our history, and our heroes. Our friend Alexei Albu, a Ukrainian activist from Odessa, who was severely injured in the trade union building massacre in Odessa in 2014, revealed many crimes committed against friends, family, and comrades by the Ukrainian regime and the various fascist forces and militias. He showed one video where Ukrainian armored personnel carriers were running over unarmed people in the streets. These crimes must be answered for. They must take into account this evidence that we have amassed. The people of the Donbass knew a war was coming in 2014. Locals recounted their fear of a war that would split the society. People were disoriented as they recounted. One thing they are not is separatists. They never indicated such a thing. The people of the Donbass want to live in peace and to have their rights respected. When I asked them if they ever wanted to be part of Ukraine again, every single person I spoke to emphatically said no. It is clear that the people of Lugansk have spoken, Any further peace agreement must begin from that point. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. And now, last but not the least, Jackson, please, you have the floor.
Greetings, everybody. Thank you so much for having us here today. I want to share my experiences from my recent trip to the newly liberated territories of the Russian Federation in the Donbass. My journey took me to Mariupol, Tokmak, Berdyansk, Melitopol, and the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant over my 7-day trip, providing me with firsthand insight that starkly contradicts the lies and the narratives that have been propagated by the mainstream media and the Western political elite here. The following 3 points that I have laid out here are based on my observations, and they reveal a very different reality to what is promoted here in the West. Number 1, Ukraine is not seeking an end to this conflict, but is instead trying to escalate it in an unthinkably dangerous manner. Number 2, the people of the Donbass do not want to remain under Ukrainian control, but instead hold a great admiration for the Russian Federation and for President Putin. Number 3, Ukraine is not defeating Russia, but is instead using its Western support to carry out horrifying acts of terrorism against the people of the Donbass that they claim they want to save. So first, let's talk about Mariupol. It was the first place I went. During the hour-long drive into Mariupol, which we made very late in the night, I saw over 1,000 construction vehicles on the highway into the city. And that's not me being hyperbolic, it's true. I've never seen anything like that in my life. Construction teams are working diligently to rebuild not just the areas that have been destroyed by the war, but the areas that have been neglected for years and years and years by previous Ukrainian governments. In Mariupol itself, in the city, the work of these construction teams was all the more evident. There are new schools, beautiful parks, gyms, theaters, stores, hotels, and thousands of homes that have been given free to the victims of the conflict in Mariupol and for the surrounding areas. Residents expressed their gratitude for a government that is proactive and committed to responding to their needs. Mariupol residents also proudly shared with me the remarkable efficiency of these construction crews. I talked to one little girl, 14 years old, at a park that I visited in Mariupol, and she told me that the construction teams that Russia sends in can build 2 blocks of infrastructure within 1 to 2 weeks. And I told her how amazing that was, because in America it takes years to get a permit to build at least 1 road. But that was the truth. That's what was really going on, and it was incredible. The massive reconstruction effort essentially shows a nation that is actually committed to rebuilding and supporting its people, which is something that we have long abandoned in this country with our government. Next was my visit to Tokmak. This was located about 15 kilometers from the front line, and this was a very stark revelation for me. Contrary to the claims that Ukraine seeks to save the people of the Donbass from Russian invaders, the truth was far different. The truth was that I witnessed a horrifying campaign of terrorism against innocent civilians living in the city of Tokmak. The first site that we encountered in Tokmak was a massive crater from a missile that had exploded just a few feet from a kindergarten playground, just 2 months before I'd arrived. The windows of the kindergarten were completely shattered, and there was glass all across the schoolyard. In addition to that, we also went on and moved 1 street over, where we saw a civilian building that was hit by a U.S. ATACMS missile. This was nothing new for the people there, because just the street over, we saw another building that had been hit by a U.S.-supplied ATACMS missile two weeks after. And there were 2 civilians that were killed in this attack. Several others were injured. I had the opportunity to climb all the way up to the top of that second building that was hit by a U.S. missile. And there was a few of us journalists that went up there. It was very dangerous because the entire roof of the building had collapsed. But what shocked me the most was in the building, I didn't see Russian military supplies. I didn't see guns. I didn't see Kalashnikovs or anything like that. I saw school supplies. I saw children's toys. And I saw everyday household items. When I descended from the top of the building, which was in tatters, I actually had the opportunity to talk to the wife of one of the victims of this attack. Her husband was actually killed in the attack. They tried to save him. His leg got blown off by this U.S. missile, and he bled out on the scene despite the best efforts of the people that were trying to revive him. She explained that Ukraine was routinely targeting their neighborhood with missile strikes, fully aware that they were bombing civilian areas rather than military targets. So for every time that Zelensky comes out and begs for more weapons, more missiles, more U.S. support, just know that it's being used to bomb innocent civilians in places like Tokmak and all across the Donbass. Also in Tokmak, we crossed the street one more time to a third building that had been bombed by a U.S. supplied missile 2 weeks before we arrived. So all of this happened in the span of 2 months. In a garden in front of the building that we visited, several elderly residents shared their experiences with us. Some of these residents had actually voted for Zelensky for president in 2019, but now expressed their profound disgust in his actions and the U.S.-backed Ukrainian terrorism affecting their homes. They now voiced their total admiration for Russian President Vladimir Putin, and they had nothing but nice things to say. There was one old woman who barely spoke Russian. She was speaking Ukrainian, and she said one thing in Russian. She said, "Ya tebya, President Putin," which means "I love President Putin." It was very interesting to hear from the actual voices of the people of the Donbass, because everyone in the mainstream media, doesn't matter if it's on the left or the right, has failed to actually report on what the people there are saying. Lastly, and probably most shockingly, was my visit to the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. This power plant has been in the news quite a bit recently. It's the largest nuclear power plant in all of Europe. It has 6 reactors, none of which are operational at the moment. But what I saw there highlighted the grave risk posed by Ukraine's military actions above everything else. Despite the plant being just a few kilometers away from the front line, we were very close to the front line. Thousands of heroic workers continue their duties at the plant each and every day. 95% of these workers worked at the plant when it was under Ukrainian control. However, several points of critical infrastructure at the plant have recently been compromised by Ukrainian drone attacks and shelling. In fact, the director of the plant gave me this right here. This is a fragment from one of the drone attacks on the plant that occurred just feet away from where the reactors lie in the ground. So, he said it was my taxpayer dollars that did this, so I got to keep the fragment. I was very appreciative. One other very alarming sight that I witnessed at the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant was a missile from the United States, which was lodged halfway in the ground, just 100 feet away from the plant's nuclear storage facility. This reckless attack could have led to a catastrophic nuclear disaster, endangering millions of lives. Such actions are far from the moral code of conduct that any real military, any just military, should uphold. In conclusion, my observations from the Donbass reveal a reality that is starkly different from the narratives presented by Western mainstream media and politicians. The truth I've witnessed shows that Ukraine is not on the path to victory, but rather escalating a conflict where there is no need to do so. The horrifying acts of terrorism carried out against civilians in Tokmak and the reckless jeopardization of nuclear safety at the Zaporozhye power plant illustrate a deliberate strategy of violence and escalation rather than a genuine pursuit of peace. The people of the Donbass, who have endured immense suffering, are now experiencing a measure of hope and rebuilding under Russian efforts, a hope that stands in stark contrast to the false portrayals of Russian aggression and Ukrainian victimhood. I think today, more so than ever before, we need to heed the words of the now free Julian Assange, who once said, "If wars can be started by lies, peace can be started by the truth." It is imperative that we confront these falsehoods and work towards de-escalating the conflict. And in fact, for all the journalists in attendance here today, I encourage you to visit the Donbass yourself from the side that's been liberated. CNN has indicated that they want to come out with me on my next visit to the Donbass, so we'll see if they stick to their word. But if any of you want to come out, we can talk. Most importantly, we must commit ourselves to reporting the truth, shining a light on the innocent civilians caught in the crossfire, and seeking a path to genuine peace. Only through truth and transparency can we hope to resolve this conflict and prevent the devastating possibility of a global catastrophe. Thank you.
Jackson, thank you for your speech. Thank you, gentlemen. So if we have any questions, please raise your hand, and so go ahead, please. Maybe, yeah, so.
Hello, thank you very much for your briefing. My name is Gabriel Elizondo from Al Jazeera English News Channel. I just wanted to get your guys' thoughts on, you spoke about a lot of what you saw and who you spoke to, and I was just curious, did you take video, or are you going to be publishing some of this so it can be disseminated to a broader audience? And then also another question was, we've heard some talk about some unexploded ordnance in the Donbass region. Were you able to confirm any of that or get any more information on that, either where you were or closer to the front lines from any of the people that you spoke to? Thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you. First of all, as for myself, I've already been publishing photos and videos on my Twitter account at Daniel M. Kovalik, so I urge you to check that out. I'll continue to post materials that we gathered on the trip. In terms of unexploded ordnance, that was not an issue that came up in Lugansk. However, we did meet with Eva Bartlett, who's a journalist who was in Mariupol and Donetsk, and she said there was a lot there, and in fact, more than on other trips. And she herself was very nervous to walk around because there was not just unexploded ordnance, but there were these pedal mines that presumably Ukrainians have put down, which are very small, in which people can step on and lose a limb, maybe be killed as well. And she saw actually saw some of those on her last trip there. So, thank you.
Vladimir, okay, if you like, yeah.
My name is Volodymyr Ichenko, National News Agency of Ukraine, Ukrinform. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for this clown show you've just put on. But my question is quite serious. Are you aware that according to the UN General Assembly resolutions, Donetsk, Luhansk regions and the Autonomous Republic of Crimea are temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine? And are you aware of your responsibility for illegally visiting Ukrainian territories and for the lies you spread? Thank you so much.
Well, I'll just say we didn't speak any lies, so I'll just dispense with that. In terms of our legal obligations, I think we're free to visit anywhere we want to visit. And by the way, there's no U.S. Prohibition on visiting those areas. I actually, now that I have visited Russia and the new territories, I do get stopped at customs on the way home. And I'm very honest about where I've been, and I've not been told ever that that was inappropriate or a problem. So,
Caleb, please.
Sure. I'm Caleb Maupin with RT. I was wondering if our speakers could assess the overall mood of the population in the Donbass and where the people are at, despite everything that's been happening. And I was also wondering if they could reflect on any similarities between the Russian people and the American people. So those are my two questions. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question. As for the mood of the people in Ukraine, the people are very hopeful. As I mentioned, there's a lot of reconstruction efforts that are underway right now, and they are very appreciative of the Russian Federation for doing that. One thing I'll say that shocked me was a lot of the people that we met who were just like workers at hotels or people at restaurants we went to were actually coming back from being abroad. So they left at the start. They told me, they said, you know, I was opposed to this at the start. I was very scared at the start. So I went to Germany. I went to wherever. And now they're coming back and they're working and they're happy and they see what's actually going on. So I think that there's a lot of people that are seeing what's actually going on and hearing from the people that have stayed in the Donbass and are happy to be back. As for similarities between the Russian people and the American people, I think there's too many to count. But what I'll say is that we're both kind of like the delinquents of Europe that have gone on to forge our own new incredible paths. Russia has done so much in the path of achieving sovereignty for America, supporting us in countless pursuits of our own sovereignty, like in the War of Independence in America. And of course, they defeated Nazi Germany in World War II, something that many of our American forefathers fought to fight against as well. So hopefully we can find peace and recognize that the path forward is better together rather than against.
Go ahead, please.
Nizar Aboud of Al Mayadeen Television in Lebanon. You made many comparisons regarding the conflict in Ukraine, in Donbass, and that of Gaza. Also, a comparison regarding Kosovo, the case. Now, one thing, how accessible is Donbass or the Luhansk and Donetsk for human rights groups? That's one question. Another thing, you mentioned intents of escalation egged by the United States, the West in general, and there were bombardment to Zaporozhye. This intention of escalation, whether it is in Ukraine and in the eastern Donbass area or in Gaza, what is the end game do you think this will bring about? Also, will there be any, do you think, any impartial investigation regarding who was bombarding Zaporozhye? You mentioned that there were traces of, or shrapnels of U.S. weapons, if I am not wrong.
Yes.
Were any other shrapnels being shown to you from different sources?
Sure. In terms of the last point there, after every attack happens, there's a commission that goes out there and collects the shrapnel and the evidence and stores it. So when we spoke with the Human Rights Ombudsman, Anna Soroka, she indicated to me that a lot of this is kept and cataloged for a future tribunal that they hope will happen, because these are war crimes that are being committed, especially targeting of infrastructure and civilian sites. So they are keeping an extensive record. They had photographs, they had displays with a lot of this stuff. They even have captured equipment that we were able to see, both in the Donbass as well as in Russia itself. So there's no doubt that these munitions are being used. Of course, if they're being shipped there, they're being used. They're not just being, stored there. On the other point of the comparison, I think first and foremost, it's very important that we see the situation in the Donbass as connected with that in Gaza and in the wider region. We see these as the remnants of a U.S. hegemonic system that is in decline. We see, of course, people yearning for their freedom and their liberation. Palestinians yearning for statehood, for recognition, for their self-determination, as well as the people in the Donbass and in Crimea who have advocated for that. But of course, there are tremendous crimes being committed by the U.S., by its allies, its regional proxies like Israel, and of course its regional proxies, in this case, Ukraine. We were made aware of so many. There are so many to list. I mean, you could write books and books of the crimes that have been committed. And I hope that our delegation is but one small point on a much larger delegations, like you've mentioned. Human rights observers are there. We spoke with the Human Rights Ombudsman. UN has been there. Other groups have been there. Of course, to go there, you have to have an open mind to a different perspective. One thing that was very clear to us is that other groups have come there with their own agenda and have made it very difficult because they have a completely different narrative and they want to force that on the ground. But of course, they're very open to us. They accepted us with open arms. And of course, Dan rightfully noted to me, we don't get the red carpet treatment when we go there. We are academics, journalists, scholars, and we also get stopped at the border in Russia. We also have our phones checked. We are not given any sort of preferential treatment. we are treated just as anyone else who is going to a war zone, because this area is a zone that is under active military, seeing active military combat. So I think it's very important to draw the parallels, but of course to differentiate us. We are not, we're not stooges. We are scholars in our own right. I mean, Dan is a very distinguished human rights lawyer, labor lawyer, and activist. So to make that claim, I think, is disingenuous, to say the least. But I think the comparisons between Gaza and Ukraine and what's going on in the Donbass are very important. And I think that they reveal something much larger about the global system now, and where we are and where we're headed.
If I can just add a few things. First of all, just in terms of the accessibility of the Donbass to human rights groups or others, again, to reiterate, we took a commercial bus 15 hours from Moscow to Lugansk, like a Greyhound, right, with other Russians and Ukrainians. No special authorization to go, besides, we had a visa to get into Russia, which you need, but not to get into the Donbass. We were held in customs on the border of Lugansk, which is still there, for, I don't know, an hour or so. Our phones were taken, I assume, checked thoroughly, because we had to give our passcodes and other things. But in any case, they let us in, again, without special authorization. So I think that's important to note, and I assume others can do the same. Also, just to note, I was stopped at the airport when I flew into Moscow from Doha for 5 hours till 2 in the morning for them to check on my security. Again, just to point out, we weren't favorite sons of Putin or anyone going. We went there on our own, and we had Ukrainians who helped us. And by the way, I'll just note, since no one's asked it yet, we are here today in New York City on our own dime. I flew here from Pittsburgh. I bought my own plane ticket. I'm paying for my own cabs and my own food. So, we're not getting Russian sponsorship for any of this. I'll just say, the wars in Gaza and Ukraine, I would submit you can't compare. I mean, we know that in Gaza, record numbers of children have been killed. Record numbers of journalists, record numbers of doctors. What's happening in Gaza is a genocide, pure and simple, which the West and the United States and the Biden administration are supporting to the hilt, despite all of their chest thumping about human rights. I don't view the war in the Ukraine the same. I mean, I think Russia, in truth, has been trying not to kill civilians. That has not been the goal of the operations. In Gaza, it's very clear that is the goal. That is the only goal, because it is genocidal. In terms of where we're going with all this, I fear we are heading towards World War III. And I think there are people in the White House that want that. And sadly, since World War II, we've always had a president in office, however bad they may be, who thought one of their main duties was to prevent that. Sadly, it's very clear after this debate, we don't have any president who is going to stop anything. The White House has apparently been taken over by neocons who want war. And the fact that, the Biden administration says Ukraine can use Western weapons to attack deep within Russia, that Ukraine has attacked radar systems in Russia designed not for self-defense against a close enemy like Ukraine, but against intercontinental ballistic missiles from the United States, has to make Russia wonder whether the U.S. is preparing for a first strike. This is very dangerous, what's happening, very dangerous. And that the alarm bells are not being sounded, again, in the press, it's just shocking to me. I'll just say, like a year or so ago, there was even some bizarre public service announcement here in New York City saying, oh, if there's a nuclear attack, go in the subways. And the woman at the end said, New Yorkers, you got this. I'm sorry, we don't got it. No one's got it. No one should want this. But the irresponsibility of the West on all this is just, to me, shocking. And being aided and abetted, I'm sorry, by the press that should be holding them accountable. By the way, I have a little prop, a little book I was given by the Human Rights Ombudsman about the children killed in the Donbass since 2014, between 2014 and 2021, which is a very sad book, but a very interesting, historic document about this war again going on before 2022, if people want to take a look at it. Thank you.
Denise?
Denis Solovov, Russian news agency TASS. Thank you for this briefing. So you had a chance to visit Donbass, to reach out to the people living there. So you actually have first-hand information. So based on this, I'm wondering, what do you consider the best possible ending of the conflict in Ukraine regarding people living there? And when could it happen? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple of us said that in the end, I don't think the Donbass in particular or Crimea can go back to Ukraine. I mean, I think Ukraine wants the land, but not the people, at least the current regime has made that clear. And I think ultimately the deal on the table will not include those areas going back to Ukraine. Though we know, by the way, that that could have been a deal, right? That in March of 2022, apparently there was a peace deal that Zelensky signed that would have allowed them to keep all their territory, and the U.S. and UK intervened to nix that. That's got to be pointed out. How the U.S. probably prevented Ukraine from getting that territory back. I think ultimately this will be settled through peace negotiations. You're even hearing Zelensky talk about the need for those negotiations. I think, though, it will probably end up with, again, certainly the Donbass and Crimea being part of Russia. The rest, I don't know. But that's what I perceive. And again, I think you can blame the U.S. for preventing that peace deal from going through only a month after the conflict began.
I'll just say that the number one concern on the minds of the people in the Donbass is the, safety and security of their families, their kids, where they work. And when I returned from my trip to the Donbass, I had the pleasure of interviewing the vice chairman of the Duma, Duma member Babakov, and he told me, when I asked a similar question, that the goal of Russia, of course, is to liberate the territories in question that have been outset by the Russian Federation. But one of the other important tasks of the Russian Federation now, as Ukraine continues to launch longer and longer, range missiles into these territories and into Russian territories, is that they need to have a security buffer zone. So for however long those missiles keep flying, if they go, 1,000 kilometers, well, there needs to be a discussion had about how far and how long and how large that buffer zone will be for the Russian Federation.
I would also add that one thing for peace that's needed is the respect for the Russian language, the Russian culture, and the Russian history. There's no denying the historical facts and the history on the ground. That area was part of the Russian Empire for centuries, that the people share cultural values, that the people lived in one empire or country for so long. There's no denying that. So the denial of the rights towards people who want to speak Russian, who want to maintain Russian culture, who want to honor May 9th and Victory Day during the Great Patriotic War, those need to be respected. I think history needs to be respected. And I really believe that for peace to happen, I think that neo-Nazi, nationalist, ultra-nationalist, and fascist ideology should be prohibited in the country. That should be something that should be prohibited everywhere. How can we accept these ideologies in a democratic society? I mean, we can accept freedom of speech, but to then arm these groups, to then incorporate them in the military, to then give statues to Bandera and to SS Galicia members, this for me, as somebody whose grandparents fought in Greece as communist partisans against the fascists, but the Italians, the Germans, and the Bulgarians, this for me is reprehensible. Because we fought to save Jews, we fought to save our people, and we fought to liberate Europe from this scourge. The fact that this is happening in Europe now, in 2024, is reprehensible, is something that must be condemned. So I think any peace must account for these concerns as well, because they are concerns of the population, ultimately. We saw many statues. There's no statues of Lenin, no statues of the Great Patriotic War have been taken down in the Donbass. They have been taken down throughout other parts of Ukraine. This needs to be accounted for, this needs to be discussed, and it needs to be hammered out in any peace agreement. Thank you.
Deji, please.
Yes, gentlemen, I have a very short question. we know that UN is delivering humanitarian aids in Ukraine, and the RC, the residential coordinator, always said that the delivery of humanitarian aids has always been denied to go to the Russian-occupied areas, which means Donbass and Donetsk, and, you know. So, in your visit, according to your assessment, does these places, areas, need humanitarian assistance, and will Russia had enough capacity to do that? Thank you.
In our investigation, and when we were on the ground, there was tremendous aid and support. I mean, we went into a market and were so surprised at the variety of things that you could purchase. We didn't see many of the things, at least in Lugansk and in Alchevsk, that might be on the front line. Of course, now that these regions have been incorporated within the Russian Federation is providing for all the material needs for the people. Not only the basic necessities, food, water, but also necessities, education, healthcare, living spaces and quarters, the expansion of infrastructure. So at this point, because from 2014 to 2022, there might have been a greater need, there was much more concern at that time. Since 2022 and the start of the special military operation, as well as the Russian Federation's decision to incorporate these areas after they requested that, then there has been really no real need for outside aid. That aid can be taken care of solely by the Russian Federation, who is doing it phenomenally well in our perspective.
And I can tell you, trucks are lined up by the hundreds going into the crossing that we passed. A lot more trucks are getting in there than the Rafah crossing, I can tell you that.
Alexei.
Thank you so much for doing this. Got really short question to all of you. Did you have any problems with U.S. authorities because of your trip to Donbass area? Thank you.
No, and also the border agent that allowed me to re-enter, I struck up a very interesting conversation with him about BRICS and de-dollarization, so I had no problems.
I had no issues as well.
Yes, I have issues. Ever since I went to Russia the first time and the Donbass in December 2022, I'm now stopped nearly every time I come back into the country and interrogated at customs. I had global entry that was revoked without notice or right of appeal. So I would just say that's the issue, that they're always friendly questionings, and I'm always happy to answer whatever questions I have because I have nothing to hide. But I mean, that is a new thing for me after going to the Donbass. That my entry into the U.S. is not easy anymore. So.
This was our first time, so ask us the second time, and we'll let you know. We'll update you.
Please.
Thank you very much, folks. My name is Sinan. I'm with Ruda Media Network, a Kurdish outlet. My question is about the population. Can you please give us a little bit more detail? Like, what's the population there now? How was it before the war and after the war? And if there was a big displacement, where did they go, these people? And the second question is, can you give us a little bit more information about the education? Are the kids able to go to school there? How is it like now? Thank you.
Well, so, there's conflict going on. So obviously, most of the towns in these regions have had a decrease in population. I mentioned I visited Berdyansk, which is on the coast. They actually I think they had a slight increase in their population because it was away from the front line and a lot of people went there. But also a lot of people, left the territories, left Ukraine. Some went to Russia. I met with the Zaporozhye Youth Ministry, and a lot of those kids had been, supported by the Russian Federation. They had gone there, they had gone schooling, and done whatever they needed to do in Russia, which was something that was misreported in the mainstream press in the West. They reported that Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, was kidnapping kids from the Donbass. But the fact of the matter is the people that were kidnapping kids in the Donbass were Ukrainian oligarchs who were ripping them out of orphanages. In some cases, at the Zaporozhye Youth Ministry building, they told us that The Ukrainian SBU came in and actually burned down all the records of orphanages so they wouldn't be able to track kids who were stolen and who were trafficked all across the world. So there's a lot of answers regarding that, lots of different outcomes for the people there.
I don't know the exact numbers. I can say that there was a lot of immigration into Russia from the Donbass since 2014. I think even at the time of the special military operations, I think something like 500,000 people in the Donbass held Russian passports, actually. And again, the people who hosted us were in Moscow were immigrants from Ukraine, from all over, Kiev, Odessa, the Donbass. So certainly there's been an immigration. Whether some have moved back or not, I really couldn't tell you that. But I'll just a little anecdote. So one time I went to Russia, again, within this about year and a half period, I went through Estonia. I flew into Tallinn and took a bus into Russia. And again, I was held there for about 5 hours. And one thing I noticed was a lot of blue passports from Ukraine, a lot of Ukrainians trying to enter Russia from that area, which, again, I just found interesting. I don't know. I think Russia has, if not the most, certainly the second most Ukrainian immigrants since 2014. I guess Poland claims to have the most, but I think Russia is not far behind on that.
We also met with, of course, Faina and other young people that were there, and so schools are working. Of course, it's difficult conditions, as you can imagine, in a war zone, especially in a war zone where the front line isn't only on the front line. There are missiles that are flying, tens or hundreds or even thousands of kilometers in some instances. So I think that it's important to recognize. We visited some schools. We saw some new schools being constructed. The technical university in Alchevsk was getting redone, and people had graduated within this period of time. From 2014 to 2022, they had received their degrees. In fact, our Alexei, our friend there, our colleague, had received his degree, his master's degrees from the technical university in metallurgical science. So they're functioning, but they're functioning under really dire situations. Life is trying to get on as best as possible, and people are trying to live, as they all do everywhere in every conflict zone, as normally as possible. But it is very difficult, and they have a lot to overcome.
And we did visit one school that was destroyed by Ukraine in 2014, and I don't think I think it's in the process of being repaired. It has not been repaired yet. It was mostly burned out from that operation.
Dan, you mentioned that you are worried that the West is heading for World War III. Which area do you believe is most dangerous in this respect, Ukraine, Middle East, or South China Sea, that can trigger World War III?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. I think, well, obviously in the Middle East, I think they're headed towards a regional war, sadly, that's going to probably include Lebanon. I mean, it seems like that's where they're headed, and would probably include Iran. I see that more, though, as being limited as a regional conflict. I think the conflagration of a world war type, I think, is more likely to grow out of what's happening in Ukraine, for sure. I mean, that's my view, because of the fact that NATO is, well, frankly, very open about the fact that it wants to confront Russia. I mean, it's very open about the fact that it's using Ukraine to go after Russia, and that it wants to do that more directly. I think the U.S. just authorized private military contractors to go into Ukraine and fight. I mean, which I think Biden admitted would be, a form of direct confrontation. So, I mean, this is, again, during the first Cold War, this would have been unfathomable, right? The closest we got was the Cuban Missile Crisis, and no shot was fired then, right? And that was resolved in 13 days through negotiations. This sort of thing, where you have a hot war happening with NATO very involved and Russia on the other side, it's not something we've ever seen. And it's very dangerous. And the Western leaders, for the most part, don't seem willing to step back from that brink, and some of them talking about wanting to break up Russia. And, I mean, that kind of talk is just insane, I think. So I think that, sadly, is the most likely candidate for starting a major conflagration.
And I'll just say, moments before we came out here, it was reported that there was another drone attack on the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. It injured several of the workers there. And as I mentioned, and I'll be publishing a video of this later on, U.S. missile 100 feet away from the nuclear storage facility at Europe's largest nuclear power plant. Even if there's a mistake, something will inevitably happen if this continues to go on and continues to drag on without any sort of negotiation. And something like that could easily result in World War III.
All the people in this region told us overwhelmingly, I don't think there was anybody, we want a ceasefire. We want an end to the fighting. So just like people are, have been calling for ceasefire in Gaza for so long now, it's now become, what's going to happen? People have been asking since 2014 for a ceasefire in the Donbass. And repeatedly, they've been asking for negotiations, for peace. They want to get their lives going on. But 10 years of war, how long is the West going to go with this? How deep are we going to get in it? I have the same fears as Dan and Jackson have about this escalating by willing it to escalate or by accident. Who knows? With so many weapons, with so much there in terms of infrastructure, like the nuclear power facility in Zaporizhia, we're very close. We're very close. It's very concerning to me, being on the ground, seeing all the military equipment, seeing all of the munitions, the air, what was going on. It's a very dangerous situation. We have to take it seriously.
Please.
Thank you very much. Can I just ask a quick follow-up, Jackson? You were talking about your trip many times to Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. It would seem that would be quite complicated to just walk into a nuclear power plant. Who helped you organize that? And were you able to walk freely and talk to people freely? And then also, who, from your assessment, who is providing security there right now? And it's my understanding all 6 nuclear reactors have been shut down. But nevertheless, it seems like it would be quite complicated to get there and get permissions to get inside. So if you can just give a little more detail on that, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, my trip to Zaporozhye in particular was something that I think the other journalists on our trip, they got to partake in some capacity, but I had the privilege of also interviewing the director of the power plant. So I don't know exactly who was the one that gave the green light for me to go in there, and I got to see the U.S. missile, some of the things that the others didn't get to see. I don't know. But what I can say is, as for security, there's a lot of security. I mean, I think we had to go through maybe like an hour and a half of security protocols before we were even allowed through the front gates. But I would not be surprised if the most, the most expert security was the type of security I wouldn't have been able to have seen from the ground, probably air defense systems working on the top of the plant, and with good reason, given how many of these drone strikes have been taking place and missile attacks and whatnot. The other part of your question, was I allowed to talk to people? Yeah. I mean, they don't speak English, but we could talk to people. We had, the moment we got there, when we got into the facility, we got to sit down and eat lunch at the cafeteria with all of the workers. There was IAEA workers there, so got to talk to them. They spoke English, but everyone else didn't speak English, but we could talk to whoever we wanted to.
Any other questions? Thank you so much again for joining us. Stay tuned. Yeah, thanks.